Orisa in my Overwatch League games? Surely this tank is too bad to be played. Well, as usual, we've had another round of adaptation and innovation from our Overwatch League weekend. Some of it good, some of it bad. I'm going to be talking a little bit about both. Now, this week, once again, we're going to be talking about the Florida Mayhem and the San Francisco Shock. It doesn't seem to matter what teams play or what teams do. We always seem to be talking about these teams' innovations, and some of it is good and some of it is bad. Now, as we talked a little bit about the Orisa composition, I want to bring up a very important point about Moira. You see, one of the things that we've been seeing more in the Overwatch League, as I switch my overlay here, is a little bit more Moira play. Now, I talked about this in probably I think it was the first video we did on the series, which basically discussed how Moira had the Coalescence ult charge buff, the heal sustain increase on her heal over time, the ability to fade during coal. So she's received a lot of minor buffs, and basically that meant that some teams were toying around with her as an anti-dive composition as a support pick. And I talked about how that might be something that we continue to see moving forward. Well, it's gone beyond that. Teams like Mayhem have actually innovated and started to use Moiras in their just raw Brawl compositions, even if the enemy team isn't running dive. In fact, one of the things that you see here is the Mayhem's ability to execute their composition with Reaper May, closing the distance quickly on the more pokey-oriented style with the Batiste, and then being able to assassinate the backline. You see, that's the strength of this composition. You don't necessarily have to kill backline. However, you do need to create a tight, short sight line where the Moira Reaper composition gets absolute maximum value. If you were to run this versus a Batiste Hanzo, Batiste Sojourn, and they're able to take angles and create distance between themselves and you, you're going to have a real problem. And it's not a surprise that we've seen the Reaper Moira compositions on most maps where you're going to be able to close the distance tightly. For example, Oasis University. And I'm going to let this kind of play out, but Shock struggled with this immensely. They really were unable to keep their backline up. Every time their May turned a corner, the Reaper was instantly forcing Ice Block. They're able to get on top of the Batiste with ult economy over and over and over and over again. And I mean, again, like backline's dead again. And this is kind of something that Mayhem were doing really well. Now, we've talked about Mayhem's ability and willingness to adapt and do weird stuff all the time. And this is one of the great examples of it. Now, is this the meta Brawl composition? No, I think that this is something that is strong enough to justify playing on some maps, and if you have the hero picks for it, Mayhem absolutely do. However, I don't think most teams are going to be playing this Brawl composition on most maps, but who knows? It remains to be seen. Moira is a pretty strong pick, and it allows you to kind of bypass the Rematch trade and go immediately for backline and or DPS, something that Shock was struggling immensely. Now, this was a very important match in the innovation that we saw this past weekend, because Florida was able to honestly just completely roll Shock with this composition and kind of springboard an adaptation in the way that Brawl comps are being used, because it started to showcase that if you play this Reaper Moira composition well, you can actually dumpster the superior Batiste Brawl compositions that have slightly more range spam. And now, let's talk a little bit about Orisa, because Orisa springboarded from this matchup because teams started to realize the power of the Moira Brawl in certain maps, and some teams like Shock just didn't want to fight Mayhem on the Moira Brawl. You saw the mistake that the Gladiators made just yesterday trying to mirror Mayhem on the Moira Brawl, and it went predictably poor. It's something that Mayhem are just better at because they were the ones that innovated it. And so what Shock does is, Shock, in a rare positive moment for this season, goes, you know what? Screw you guys. We're going to counter your Moira Brawl and play to something that we're going to out Mayhem the Mayhem by pulling something out of our hats. And that was the Orisa composition. Now, before we talk about the goals of the Orisa composition, let's actually talk about Orisa as a hero, because Orisa is a very unusual hero, and that she's filled, everybody knows Orisa's niche, but her niche is just not good enough to being played. I think a lot of people are confused about what she's strong at, but most OWL players aren't really confused. It's essentially anti-dive spam, sorry for the font size there, and it's specifically on tighter maps and dive comps without spam. You see, the irony of Orisa is that she is the spam hero of Overwatch 1, and she still has a lot of spam in Overwatch 2, but she's like the high school bully that you kind of grow up and you're like, man, that guy was pathetic, like he doesn't know anything. That's kind of Orisa's spam potential. She can only beat up on the weak spam heroes. If you're playing Reaper, if you're playing Moira, if you're playing Rematch, she will brutalize you with her spam damage and her pressure. It's actually really important that she gets that spam pressure out. Winston, Sombra's, Tracers. But as soon as you introduce Hanzo and Batiste and Zenyatta, not only does she not match them in the spam, she also doesn't have the mobility to be able to close the distance and actually dive them. You see, the tanks in Overwatch 2 either have mobility so that they can close the distance on you, or they have some sort of self-sustain that they don't need to get on top of you. I mean, if you're looking at a Reinhardt versus a Zenyatta, at least a Reinhardt can pin and close the distance. Orisa has nothing. She has no tools whatsoever to be able to close the distance, and that's the problem. Drunkard Queen has Shout. Orisa has her Javelin Spin, which does technically increase her movement speed, but that's one of her defensive cooldowns. She doesn't want to use a defensive cooldown to close the space. So Orisa historically has been used versus some Winston comps in short sightlines, Winston comps without spam, as kind of a cheese to disrupt, force bubble, force out, maybe a recall, pressure out the enemy spam. She's got a good matchup versus Reaper. She's got a good matchup versus May. A lot of short-range anti-dive maps. But as we said, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because not only is Orisa being played in these situations, as you guys might have noticed, you're like, well, Shock wasn't playing into Winston. Why are we playing Orisa into Brawl? Well, if you're going to notice something about the Orisa composition that they're playing into, or the composition that that Mayhem was rolling out on, notice something here? There's a real lack of range damage. That's a green flag for Orisa. Another thing to notice, it's a relatively short sightline map, so that it's not something that Orisa is going to get off-angled, dove on flanks to where she can't access. It's actually relatively tight. You see, this is a dream composition for Orisa to play into. She's got a great matchup versus Reaper. She's impossible to kill. She's impossible to kill versus May. Freeze doesn't do anything. Moira Lucio, no reasonable or super high spam damage. And this is the big one. She actually has a reasonably good matchup versus Rematch. Now, tank trades isn't just about tank versus tank. It's often about how does the tank do versus the entire composition. For example, Rematch does significantly better versus the traditional spam dive or spam brawl compositions. He can use his Nemesis form with the inherent speed boost and be able to close the distance on Batiste and Hanzo. In fact, Ramatra is the #1 reason why we don't see Hanzo in every single map. Hanzo is too easy to nail down, and it's why we continue to see Sojourn in Brawl. But Orisa, if there's nothing else that's poking her out versus the Ramatra, this is where Ramatra really struggles. You actually have reasonably about the same amount of spam damage, but Ramatra doesn't, as in his fragile Omnic form when he's doing it. She also has Javelin, which not only is really powerful in the Ramatra when he's in Nemesis form, but it also cancels his black and exposes him up to damage and this freaking massive hitbox. Like, not to mention the punches on a fortified Orisa does like a ridiculously low amount of damage. Somebody in the chat do the math for me. It's like 40 damage or something like that. So in the raw tank matchup, Orisa dumpsters Ramatra. And if there's no other DPS or supports that counter Orisa with poke damage, if there's aren't a lot of off angles that Orisa has to worry about, then the Orisa is straight up better. You see, if this is something that we continue to see more of, Orisa does counter this, and she does so very well. Not to mention the ult combos that she could do with her ultimate. It's still pretty bad, but it's actually very, very quite strong. In fact, Orisa's only weak on maps where there's a lot of open dive, and if you were to commit to an actual spam brawl composition. Now, there's one other little pick here that you could do versus the Orisa, which I figured I'll point out. It's Reinhardt. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. Reinhardt is countered by Orisa. No, that is a plat skill check. In fact, it's the opposite. Reinhardt does very well versus Orisa because Reinhardt can easily kite out and survive Fortify. Javelin spin, knocking Reinhardt back, irrelevant. Javelin is also blockable. Spam damage, I've got a shield for that. And a shield that's not on a cooldown, but is consistently available. You see, as Reinhardt, it's easy to take a wall trade within Orisa Brawl composition, go, there's Fortify, guys, let's chill, and re-push back in. That's something that Orisa actually struggles in. So Ryan team compositions, even if they were to play Reaper May, would do pretty well versus an Orisa composition. But you don't even have to play that. Just run spam, take angles, the Orisa composition struggles. Now, let's keep talking here. Why did this work? Because if you go back here, if you look at the actual matchup, which matchup am I looking at here? This is the one I'm looking for. Didn't Mayhem roll out on the counter comp? They didn't even roll out on Reaper May. They actually rolled out on spam damage. In fact, Mayhem might have had scouting information that would have led them to believe that they're going to try and roll out on a Reaper Moira counter. And sure enough, look at what Shock roll out on. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Hanzo. It's bizarre. Maybe Proper isn't comfortable on the Reaper or something like that. Maybe they're not comfortable. This is a weird isolatable. I don't generally like the Hanzo plus the Moira comp because the Moira doesn't have the ranged heal to keep the Hanzo on an off angle, and that's exactly what Hanzo wants to do, is take a longer sightline, right? So it's a weird thing that Shock kept pulling out, and it was a weak point of the composition. But anyway, long story short, so it's a counter comp. So why did the Mayhem lose this round so bad? And I actually think this is where Mayhem get Mayhemed. It is a little bit of hubris and or lack of preparation. Maybe they weren't ready for this. Maybe they didn't have the practice. Fighting for a brawl fight on a short sightline with a Moira Orisa composition on high ground is not going to work, and surprisingly it doesn't work. And so the fights here where Shock are able to close the distance, they win. The fights where Mayhem are able to open up and take angles and to be patient, they win instead. So it's basically a war of whether Mayhem was going to execute properly or make goofy errors, and ultimately I believe this round was more of the latter. A lot of goofy errors and a lot of impatience. Even this, a lot of impatience, forcing, when really all this composition needs to do is to take off angles. In fact, you could probably even guarantee that Merit would get more value if he was on Hanzo right now. I don't think the Hanzo is punishable by the Orisa. I think the Orisa is too slow. So you could read your spam angles even higher and absolutely annihilate Shock's composition. And in fact, where Shock struggled, even if Mayhem was doing it accidentally, was when you had Shock taking off angles and slowly whittling down and forcing the Orisa's cooldowns. Remember, the Orisa doesn't have relevant spam damage versus these compositions, and in addition, she has to use her cooldowns to just stand still. And that's the weakness of the composition right there. Again, you can kind of see the Hanzo weakness here. But anyway, long story short, we're going to move on to the next round because there's more to learn from this as well. And this is where things got really confusing for me. Mayhem, again, roll out on the more spammy Brawl composition with the Rematch. And I don't know if this is an inaccurate meta read or a misunderstanding. Again, this is Mayhem getting Mayhem. Usually Mayhem are the ones that roll out the weird comp and the enemy team doesn't know what to do and they respond poorly. Now it's Mayhem. Mayhem see Orisa, Moira, Lucio, and they go, hey guys, let's push. Maybe it was the Hanzo pick that's baiting them. I'm not really sure. But Hanzo's able to easily disengage. Mayhem uses all of their cooldowns, gets basically no value whatsoever. That puts them at a cooldown deficit that allows Shock to explode out. And that eventually is going to put Mayhem in such a hole that someone is going to die. So even though someone here, there's your lamp, even though someone probably should have and could have kept blocking here, again, it's just a poor execution from Mayhem and a really good execution from Shock to punish that. And you're going to see this for this entire round, where it feels like Mayhem has a total misread of how to play versus this Orisa composition. Guys, Overwatch 2 Orisa, you spam this guy. You do not focus her down, you spam her out. You don't try to run her down when she has cooldowns. Again, you're going to see the Mayhem on a retake here, where I just don't know why they're here. Like, I don't know why. They do a rotate to clear high ground, but then all put themselves into a small room where, again, the composition from Shock is just straight up better. They're able to close the distance and just absolutely annihilate. Everything but the Hanzo here is fragile. And or is not fragile, excuse me, the very opposite of fragile, and that's again going to be a punish from Mayhem, where they should have just simply stayed high ground. And then obviously, like, everybody knows the play that happens afterwards, where I think it's the javelin here. It's the javelin off of high ground. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about right here, which is just another hero play. And that's the other thing about this hero as well. It's like if like Junmin was hitting, honestly, guys, so many javelins. Like, I can't even understate like how many fights were won just with these crazy mechanical javelins. This is it right here. Bam, he's off the map, and that's gonna be the match right there. So credit goes to Junmin for honestly playing the Orisa, at least with mechanically, really well. And Shock for rolling out in a counter comp. Now I'm gonna keep talking about Shock, but there's a couple other instances of Orisa that I want to go over first. First one was going to be the Shock when they played it on the Titans, on the Ilios Ruins. I am going to be honest, this is really just a corny composition. It's basically made to do the antithesis of what we were talking about Orisa, which is basically they're just trying to turtle on point and cycle with the Moira Kiriko heals with the May. It's honestly just terrible. It's just a garbage composition. It could work if you were to like actually force a brawl with the Junker Queen, again trying to close the distance, but they don't have the Lucio speed. The only thing that goes for them is Titans like Mayhem make a totally wrong read and at many points try to force a short range close brawl instead of just taking literally every angle with their Kiriko, every angle with their Tracer, every angle with their Sojourn, every angle with their Queen, and just whittling down on point. So it was like they're able to squeak it out, but it feels like, again, more of a misplay by the Titans than good play by Shock. And then another interesting one is actually the shoes on the other foot here, which is the Titans playing into the Shock. And the Titans are actually roll out on what they expect to be a Winston anti-dive composition, where they probably expected Shock to roll out on Winston Sombra Tracer here, but Shock instead roll out with an anti-composition of their own. This honestly feels like a little bit of, I don't want to like, this feels like a little bit of scouting. Like they might have had some information about what Titans are rolling out on, because this is a pretty hard counter. We talked about this. This comp doesn't want to, just because it's on Sombra, it doesn't matter. This comp doesn't want to spam. This comp wants to spam versus Winston. This is a comp that wants to take an angle on your Winston. Sombra on an off angle, just holding mouse one. Orisa on an off angle, just holding mouse one, denying your dive from ever happening. But remember the high school bully analogy. As soon as they face somebody that even has a little bit better spam, they completely fold. They're the ones that now have to engage and initiate, and ultimately they're unable to do so. So as they drop to point, Titans don't even know how to play this. They're like, oh crap, this is not a Winston comp. And so Punk immediately 4-5 fours. There's the wall, there's the spam, and they never really recover. Like look at the number of spam, like look at the damage that they're just taking from these off angles, right? And ultimately they just end up folding. And that's kind of like what we want to see. Like they force the brawl, but they force the brawl, Shock does, after Vancouver's already used all their cooldowns. And that's how you play versus the Orisa right there. And that's something that not a lot of other teams are doing really well. So some crazy mind games going on out here. Now, I know what everybody in chat is expecting me to talk about. And I'm going to be honest with you guys. We'll talk about it briefly. But what Shock was running on the other maps, I have no answers for. And not because I'm a dum-dum, but because it's just stupid. This right here, honestly, isn't even that bad. It actually has logic. It's a short, tight range sightline. You could expect Mayhem to run on something divey. Orisa, can actually take angles and shoot. By the way, notice that Merit goes Hanzo here. This is exactly how you want to be playing versus the Orisa. I don't think, again, Mayhem played this fight particularly well. They didn't take greedy enough sightlines. They were unable to actually execute any dives. They were unable to get any punish on Junbin whatsoever, so credit goes to Junbin, and also blame goes to Merit and RuPaul for not getting enough damage output. It takes them forever to clear off angles. Again, it looks like Shock pulling a Mayhem on the Mayhem, where they do something weird and alternative, and Mayhem looked completely lost for a long time. However, past first point, there really is no good reason to run the Orisa. You see, on second point, the sightlines are both too long and spam damage too relevant, but also the flanks are too broad, and that's where it exposes both of the Orisa's weakness. She doesn't have mobility, she doesn't have range, and this is where it's honestly, it was just inevitable. You can't, like, even if you were to try and fight on cart, they're going to take high ground, they're going to take off angles, they're going to take flanks. You're going to have every single, your Tracer's going to get harassed, your Kiriko's going to get harassed, everyone's going to get harassed for a million off angles, and ultimately the result was very predictable. And this happened on, all like throughout the entire match. Like it was honestly really quite strange that they played Orisa there. And then it gets even weirder because freaking Shock rolls out on Orisa on attack on Junkertown. The complete worst situation to run Orisa, because I remember playing Orisa on relaunch and playing her into BAP Zen compositions, and I would legitimately have to flank versus these kind of compositions so that I could actually get to squishes on backline, because if I tried to just spam, I would get my head blown off. And this is, so you don't play this on Junkertown because there's no way to get on top of the on-air break. There's no way to isolate or do anything, because even though you have a favorable tank matchup, this is why the tank rock, paper, scissors is a bit of a myth, because it's not just about the tank matchup. You have to take the tank matchup in front of the snipers. And so ultimately, this is kind of like the mistake that we see here, and it's ultimately the Orisa, like, the fact that this even got any value at all, I'm going to skip to a hilarious point in this fight, is just honestly astonishing to me. Like, just really not the pick whatsoever. I want to clip to one example of like, wait, what? How did this even work? Check this out. Junmin somehow sucks the backline off of high ground onto the cart. This is the kind of mistakes that was allowing the Orisa to even work even a tiny bit. But ultimately, even corny garbage stuff from Mayhem this match still wasn't enough to give the Orisa viability. It just doesn't have the mobility. It just doesn't have the spam to play versus these sniper compositions or versus dive compositions in open space. So Orisa will remain an anti-flavor of Brawl with the Reaper Moira, and especially if Rematch is continually able to be meta. And it will continue to be an anti-dive flavor, but only on maps that don't allow crazy flanks, and only on maps that don't allow dive to play spam heroes as well, like an Ana dive, Zen dive, to a lesser extent, a Hanzo dive. Those sort of things are a little bit weaker. So weird pick. Will remain niche, but it depends on whether Ramattra and Moira stay relevant. But outside of that, it's not going to happen until we have a firmer grasp of what Orisa can actually bring to the table, and also if the balance team does a better job of giving Orisa a more clear identity. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Probably our weirdest episode yet, and I'll see you in the next one.